Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Better Brainwaves, which is a YouTube channel that talks about all things neuro. We're looking today at our second installment or second episode in focusing on laser application. And if you haven't seen the first episode, I highly recommend you watch that first, and you watch these in order, because some of the information that is in the previous episodes would make things more easy to understand as we move forward. So hopefully, if you haven't seen the first one, go back and watch it. If you have, excellent. We're going to jump right in to the next episode on laser. And just before you do that, if you could just subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or like the episode, because that helps us with the YouTube algorithm, get more people, get this out to more people, which is really what we want to do. Okay, without further ado, we will get started, and I'll be up here in the top right, as I hopefully always am, and I'll try to explain the concepts to you as we go through. So the first thing that we need to understand in our next phase of the laser understanding is that there are a lot of different parameters that we need to consider about laser and about the tissues that we're trying to stimulate. So very important concepts like wavelength, frequency, power density, pulse structure, whether they're short pulse or long pulse, the time of the application, so the timing, and these must be chosen and determined for each type of treatment that we're going to use the laser for. Because if we have less than optimum choices of these parameters, we can result in a reduced effectiveness of the treatment, or we could even have a negative therapeutic outcome because of it. So there's an optimal dose, or optimal parameters, let's put it that way, for each therapeutic effect. So we have to decide from the onset what we're trying to achieve, and then use the parameters that best allow us to achieve that. Now, light is, so the wavelengths of light are visible in some of the laser wavelengths that we are going to use. And the visible wavelengths range approximately between 380 and 700 nanometers. So a lot of the lasers we're going to use are going to be above that. So when the laser is actually turned on, you're not going to be able to see the light from the laser coming out. So this is something that you need to be careful of. It's a safety precaution. Some laser companies will, when you're using a higher level or higher wavelength, above 700 nanometers, they'll include an LED activation so that when you turn on the laser, you can see red light coming out and you know that something's happening. Other lasers don't have that, so you need to be very careful not to look into the actual laser or shine it in someone else's eyes who's in the room with you, potentially. So we need to always remember that anything above 700 nanometers when we're using it is not going to be visible. So we need to be careful with where we're shining the laser so we don't have any acute effects on people's vision. Now, the next sort of range, which most of the treatments that we're going to do will fall into, is the infrared region, and that's between 700 nanometers and 1,000 nanometers. Now, we can go a bit higher than 1,000, 1,080, 1,060, somewhere in there. But again, we can't see those waves. So we need to remember that and be cognizant of the fact that when that laser is activated, it's activated, and the beams are coming out, whether we can see them or not. Now, this is just to remind you that this is how wavelengths change. So I've got another slide in a minute that'll talk about the actual wavelength, but you can see that as the wavelengths shorten, okay, see they get shorter and shorter, and shorter wavelengths are higher in nanometers. So as we move up the chain, we go from low frequency or low wavelengths to higher wavelengths up here. Okay, so that's how that works. And this is just to remind you of some of the things in life that exist at those wavelengths or are influenced by those wavelengths. So here's basically when we talk about light as a wave. Okay, so there's a waveform of light, and the tricky thing about light is that it actually can exist as a wave or as a particle. So both can happen at the same time. And that confused the physicists for a long time. But Einstein sort of came up with a solution for this. And so basically, there's a dual nature to light. You can have particles and waves, and we'll talk about, so the wave, which is the wavelength that I've been talking about, okay, has various components that we should know about. And the first is the wavelength is from trough to trough or peak to peak or crest to crest. Okay, so that's the wavelength. And as we increase the wavelengths, then, as we decrease the wavelengths, the number goes up. It's kind of weird, but that's sort of how it works. Now, the amplitude is measured from the center of the wave to the top of the wave. Now, that's not so important for us right now, although this amplitude will change depending upon the intensity of the laser that we have. Okay? So we have the wavelength, which is probably the most important right now to worry about. And then we have this light as a particle. So basically, when we increase the wavelength, we get, basically we increase the frequency, we decrease the wavelength. Okay, that's basically how it works. So we can see here that high energy has a greater frequency, and low energy has a lower frequency. But the wavelengths that are promoting or moving along these particles are carrying things called photons. And photons are little packets of energy called a quanta. So basically, a photon will have a quanta of energy, and it moves along at the speed of light. And the brightness of the light is based on the number of photons, and the color of the light is based on the energy in each photon. Okay, so there's energy and brightness. So the brightness is the number of photons, and the color is the energy contained within each photon. And then there's also polarization, and we can have polarization in all three dimensions. Most of the time with the laser that we're going to be using, the two other dimensions are filtered out, and we get a coherent single dimension column of light, which we talked about in the first episode. Now, the irradiance is the power divided by the spot size. Now, usually the laser beam will assume a Gaussian distribution so that the most power is generated at the apex of the Gaussian distribution. And as we move away from that, we get a reduced power. But still remember that about 85% is contained within this area here, which is the 1 over E squared, the diameter. And why is this important? It's just that if we're focusing a laser on a spot, we have to realize that the area we're focused on has the most energy, and then the energy will dissipate from there out. So that if we're not accurate in our placement of the laser, sometimes that does matter. So if we're placing the center of the laser, or we think that the center of the laser is here, but it's actually here, then the target is going to be getting this amount of energy rather than this amount of energy. So making sure the placement of the laser is correct is important. Now, this is another concept with laser that's very important, and that is what the measurement that most lasers will tell us is the power at the surface. Okay, so they'll say we're going to deliver 5 watts per centimeter squared, and that's at the surface of the tissue. What's important for us, though, for the physiological effects of the laser is what is the actual intensity or power at the target site. So if the target site is the dermis of the skin, then we need to know how much of that power actually penetrates into the skin and gets to the point where we want to stimulate. Now, what happens is with some of the light hits the surface and is actually reflected or scattered. And that's not useful. That doesn't get to the tissue, doesn't do any stimulus. It's just basically wasted. And then we have other scatter that happens usually when we transition from one tissue to another. So when we go from the epidermis to the dermis on the skin, there's a change in the tissue density, tissue type, and that causes scatter, which again doesn't give us any therapeutic effect. And then we also have this rebound where even from deep tissues, some light will be reflected back out. So really the only part that gets through is the part that gets to the tissue target that we want. And a lot of experimentation is done to understand how much depth of penetration we can get from what power of laser and what wavelength of laser. So these are all things that have to be considered. Okay, so basically we have to then consider, well, what types of materials are in our tissue that can change or attenuate the laser beam that we're sending in. Okay, and we have a chart. In the next slide I'll show you, but right now I'm going to talk about how the wavelength influences the penetration depth. So basically, short wavelengths, okay, have low penetration. High wavelengths have a deeper penetration, usually. Okay, now, sometimes depending on what type of tissue they're going into, they can change. So, for instance, certain high wavelengths, above 1,000 will not penetrate bone as deeply as ones at, say, 800. And that's based on the components of the bone itself, the skull, that type of thing, how it's composed. But in the end, what we want to measure is the actual activation of the tissue target site, which tends to be elevated when we have a greater penetration. So we can see here, again, the penetration is greater when we have high wavelengths. Now, this is the chart that is very important, this little graph here, because this is considering what types of substances either absorb or scatter or reflect laser in a large way, which we need to consider. So the red area here is the area of hydroxyhemoglobin. So when we're going through the skin or any tissue that has blood, this hydroxyhemoglobin is going to, especially in the wavelength at around 400, it's going to absorb almost everything. So in a wavelength, you're trying to put a 400 nanometer wavelength through, it's not going to get past the hemoglobin very much. It's going to be mostly absorbed. But that drops off as we get up into the higher wavelengths. So around, it stops absorbing at around 1,000 nanometers. And then we have the hemoglobin itself, which again drops off at around 1,000. And then we have melanin, which is the a chemical component of the skin that protects against sunburn and cancer and things like that in the skin. And it's absorbing light also, and it drops off around 1,000. It drops off to 0. So, and then we have this water, which rises from about 780 all the way up, so that around 1,500 nanometers, you're not getting a lot of penetration at that level. So what we then outline is that there's a therapeutic window, which is usually described where this black line is, ranging from about 640 all the way up to, around 1,400. Now, at 1,400, you're still going to lose a lot from the water. So what we usually tend to do is range around 800, 860, somewhere in there. We're still going to lose a bit here, but most of it's going to get through to about 1,000, 1,060, somewhere in there. Okay, now when this doesn't include bone, so if we're talking about penetration into the brain, we also have to consider the bone the skull, that the light has to go through, and also the cerebrospinal fluid and the meninges before we get to the actual brain tissue proper. So usually when we're looking at brain stuff and stimulating the brain, we want to be around 960 and above, so between 960 and maybe 1,060, somewhere in there. Okay, so that gives you a general idea about how absorption of the different wavelengths can affect the penetration and the amount of stimulus at the target site that we're looking for. And again, this is just reminding us that there's other things that also might affect, like the pulse rate of the laser. So if we have short pulses, we have less penetration than if we have long pulses. And then we also have different tissues where different tissue types can absorb more laser than others. So white matter, which is high in fat, because it has a lot of myelin tissue, absorbs the light and doesn't let it pass. So the depth of penetration is less than just actual gray matter, which is the cells themselves inside the brain. Now, excuse me, this is the penetration of the skull. So lots of times people think that light wouldn't go through the skull. So how are we going to get light into the brain? Well, it turns out that penetration still gets through. The light still gets through the skull and the skin and the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid, so that we can get penetration into the brain, roughly between 2 and 6 centimeters, depending upon the wavelength that we use. And we can also use long and short pulses, and we see that short pulses don't penetrate as deep as long pulses do. And long pulses can be extrapolated out to be no pulse, which means continuous laser. Now, the problem with continuous laser, there is a heat buildup that has to be accounted for, okay, depending on the wavelength and the intensity that you're using. Now, again, I'm just going to quickly review how this all works, because when we start talking in the next few episodes about effects of the laser, we're going to start getting into effects other than just increased ATP happening. Okay, so here comes the light, comes in and stimulates the mitochondria, as we talked about in the last episode. And if you haven't seen the last episode, I strongly recommend you go back just so that you get this in more detail. But the light comes in, hits the chromophores in the mitochondria, and right away we get an increase in ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, some other things that are happening is we also get an increase in nitric oxide. And nitric oxide does a lot of things. It's a vasodilator, so it dilates our vessels, and it also acts in other messenger systems that do other things. And then we also get an increase in this reactive oxygen species, used to be called free radicals. And there's a feedback system that happens with both ATP and reactive oxygen species, which alters our gene transcription. Okay, and this gene transcription can be responsible for a lot of the effects that we're seeing with laser, and we'll get into those in some of the case studies and things that we're going to look at in episode 4. But what I want you to see is that both the ATP and the reactive oxygen species, or the free radicals, have the ability to go in and change, activate, destabilize our genes. Now, these free radicals at a certain level are good, because they do a feedback loop, which basically says, hey, there's lots of ATP around, let's use it, let's activate pathways. However, if this gets too high, this can actually cause cell death. So it can be poisonous to the cell and cytotoxic. So we want this maintained always in a relatively narrow window of concentration. And this is one of the reasons why when we're doing laser stimulus, we also want to take some supplementation to mitigate or attenuate the concentration of these reactive oxygen species so they don't get too high. And these usually are taken care of by antioxidants like vitamin C, coenzyme Q10, glutathione, those types of things. So before we start the laser treatment, we want to make sure that we have 4 or 5 days of supplementation so that the supplementation levels can rise to the point where we can have a safety valve in place so our ROSs don't go too high. Now, basically, this is just a little bit more detail of how this sort of all works and how ATP production can increase based on light coming in. So basically, in a standard situation, we have the NADPH or NADH is going to lose a hydrogen and become NAD plus. Hydrogen is going to be shipped into this cytoplasm inside the mitochondria, and then as other NADHs move down, they're going to put more hydrogen in here, and then what happens is the hydrogen builds up, so the acidity in here becomes quite strong, and that strong acidity now drives hydrogen out. And when it drives it out, we convert ADP plus 1-phosphate to ATP. So that's the standard sort of metabolism that happens just in the presence of carbohydrate or glucose. Now, if we add in the increased activation of cytochrome oxidase, we now get an increased activity in this whole process, and we produce more ATP. Now, when we produce ATP, there is a built-in mechanism that also produces nitric oxide and reactive oxygen species so that they can now have a feedback loop. Okay, so this is the cytochrome enzymatic pathway that happens inside the mitochondria. Now, these are also very good areas to boost activity. So if we want to boost ATP production, maybe it's a good idea to make sure that we are also having the B complex vitamins, which are coenzymes in these reactions. So we want to have B complex vitamins. We want to have vitamin C. We want to have glutathione. We want to have coenzyme Q10. And we want to also have fish oil, because a lot of the times when we're driving, the therapeutic benefit that we want is in repair of tissue and repair of sort of skin or neurons or whatever we're trying to repair. And a lot of the times those fish oils are necessary for that repair process. So those are the basic supplementations that we would take, and that's why, because it's the coenzymes in this pathway, and that pathway is ultimately resulting in increased ATP. And again, this is just looking at the electron transport chain, which is what we just described. But I just always think that if you see more different pictures, some people will relate to one picture more than another, and some people can understand different flow charts better. So I'd rather put in too many than not enough. Okay, so we're going to call this episode finished, and we're going to move on to episode 3, where we're going to talk about a lot of really interesting things that are going to be essential in you applying laser for whatever reason, to your body, to your joints, to your brain. Okay, now, I also just want to have a disclaimer that you should not be applying laser, especially to your brain or your nervous system, without some kind of professional guidance, because you can cause damage, and we don't want that. We want to make sure all of the stuff that's happening with the laser is beneficial to you and not going to hurt you. So there are some downsides to laser that we also have to remember. So if you're going to, like, don't just order cranial lasers off the internet and then start using them on yourself without some kind of professional guidance, because there are situations where that laser is going to not be beneficial and it can actually cause damage. Okay, so you can always contact me through the contact details on the website, or I'll try to put some stuff down in the comment section where you can contact me if you have to, if you have questions about what to do. I get a lot of emails about people who've already gone out and bought a laser, and then they've started to use it and realized, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, or maybe they get nervous about it and they want some clarification. So I think that's the way to go. Find somebody you trust who knows about laser. For the most part, your GP probably won't know a lot about this. Now, they may, if they've kept up on photobiomodulation stuff, but for the most part, you're going to have to seek somebody out who does this for a living, or who has a high degree of experience. Okay, so not to scare anybody, but this is just to remember that the laser does have effects, and those effects sometimes can hurt you. Okay, so see you in episode 3. Don't forget to subscribe and like.